Working?
It's
Oh,
working.
there it is.
There, yeah.
Okay. By the way, I don't want you to be. Luke. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Church of the Holy Spirit, and welcome to our guest, Brian Johnson, this morning. He is the 126th speaker in our Faith at Work series, and here we seek to know God better through the service and lives of our guests as they take their Sundays into their Mondays. Each story is unique, compelling, and inspiring. Whether a physician, imam, CEO, janitor, volunteer, or community activist, today will be no different. We have friends zooming in from near and far, and we want to welcome all of you into this sanctuary. Luke, please begin us in prayer.
I will, and I want to thank Brian for being here, and thank you for your personal warmth to me and to especially my daughter, as Brian's been one of her guides. Let us pray. Almighty God, with various starts and stops, we have been including more and more people in the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Help us to include all of your people in all of your blessings. Give us eyes to see your image inside our neighbor, no matter their gender, race, age, sexual orientation, abilities or disabilities, origin or employment. Make divine love more than an idea in our heads, but a real part of our personal presence, until all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of Christ as though reflected in a mirror, are transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. And all of this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Brian and I are both Princeton alumni, and we met through club activities. And when I met him, I was immediately taken by his attentiveness to the conversation, very quick assimilation into the discussion, and I was not surprised when I learned that he was going to be the president of the Princeton Club of Chicago. One of the people on his leadership team described him as, quote, bringing a special combination of integrity, compassion, a welcoming attitude towards all voices and opinions, boundless energy, and a charming sense of humor. Princeton's informal motto is Princeton in the nation's service and in the service of humanity. And Brian is an exemplar in this respect. Graduating from Princeton in 1999, a JD MBA from Stanford, he has all the tools to engage in a very successful career. But success for Brian is a little bit different. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that today. Currently, he's serving as the CEO of Equality Illinois, which is a statewide civil rights organization supporting the LGBTQ since 1916. And that role, you have led Illinois to advancing equal treatment and full acceptance of the LGBTQ community, but that has expanded into thinking about many people that need to be seen and supported, which is just amazing. You've spent 2 decades as a leader in social justice, and it started young. It started with a first grader, and your sense of being catalyzed into understanding America's promise for all. And we'll learn a lot more about that. But what I like most about Brian is his humility and his sense of really being grounded in his faith, and that has been the critical elements in his leadership. But let's start with Princeton. You shared with me that you loved your time there.
Did.
It strengthened your skills and provided you with opportunity. Can you share your early years and how they led to Princeton and how Princeton further shaped those interests?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say thank you to you, Mimi, for inviting me here, to Luke, for the whole community. Houses of worship and churches have not always been places where LGBTQ plus people have felt safe and affirmed and seen. And so to be here to talk about myself, my full self, is such a treat and an honor, and I feel so blessed and humbled and grateful. So thank you. I grew up a middle-class kid. My father was an Army officer. My mom was a public school teacher. I had gone to neighborhood public schools my whole life and decided I wanted to go to Princeton. I originally didn't think I wanted to go to Princeton, and my dad said, "Can we just go look at this place?" And I was like, "Sure, but I'm not going to like it," as every wise 16-year-old kid was. I did the campus tour, and I was like, I think I want to go here. And I fell in love both on that tour, but also in the early years of Princeton, that this was a place of incredible diversity and a place that valued deep and rich curiosity, right? I mean, I was surrounded by kids from all over the country, all over the world. There were all of these clubs and sports and an incredible amount of wide diversity of academic interests. And I felt so empowered, both personally and professionally, to be curious. And I think there are few better gifts that a college can give than the courage to be curious. I was talking to Luke earlier, I thought I was going to be a history major or a politics major or a policy major. I was interested in the world around me. And I kept stumbling into religion classes, a little bit here, a little bit there. And I found that these were classes where I got to study how people viewed themselves, the world around them, and made sense of that. And I was just drawn to that. I also had this insight, which I was so lucky to have, that at a place like Princeton, nobody cares what you major in. You can go do any job afterwards. And so I said, I want to spend a couple of years studying religion. And it was there, I think, that I really honed this deep curiosity for how people different from me viewed themselves and the world around them. Taking classes on Buddhism and class on human sacrifice, a class on American religious history. I wrote my junior independent work on Frances Willard from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I wrote my senior thesis on Gandhi. And I left that time just with a much deeper set of questions about the world around me and a hunger to understand that.
And then you go to teach first graders.
I do. I do. Much to my parents' confusion. They said, wait, we spent all that money, you went to an Ivy League school, and now you're going to be a first grade teacher. Yeah, I knew I wanted to serve my country like my father had. But as I like to say, at that time, the Army and I had a mutual understanding we were not the right fit for each other. And I really admired the way my mom, as a public school teacher, even in all our moves, had always served our community through teaching. So I joined what was then a relatively new program, Teach for America, and I purposely asked, of all the places they send people, where might be the place that got the least national attention? And my first choice was to go to South Louisiana. And I was a first grade teacher on the north side of Baton Rouge in a school whose population was 100% black students and nearly 100% low income. And Mimi, it was this profound experience. Because up until that point, I had only really understood injustice in America through data and story and abstraction. Right? I like to say, I thought I was a good social justice person because I had read my Jonathan Kozol. But it wasn't grounded in relationship. And here I was in a community very different from me. And I was falling in love with my students and their parents and my fellow teachers. And I was looking around at a community rich in love and in assets, and also seeing how comfortable we were at large, perpetuating injustice and unfairness on some of the most vulnerable, and in particular, low-income kids of color. And I thought, through relationship and through deep frustration and anger, that this was something that I wanted to really continue to wrestle with. Again, not because of an intellectual understanding of injustice, because I felt that the people that I was building relationship with deserved a fuller commitment to America's promise.
Gosh, I feel like the sleeping giant was awoken in you.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that that those moments of illumination are those things that happen in our 20s.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we have to engage that, that broader system and figure out how we're going to deal with that. And so you went to law school and business school at Stanford.
I did. I mean, I want to build off that a little bit to say, that point of illumination was such a point of God's grace. I was drawn to teach that to go into teaching, to go to Baton Rouge, for a purpose that made sense, for an intellectual connection, and to be given the gifts of growing love and deepening anger and curiosity were the foundations for everything that came from that. And I did not go into that experience thinking that's what would come from it, and what incredible gifts they were.
Wow.
And to your point, I said to myself, what am I going to do with this experience? I felt called to do something outside the classroom. I'm very much a believer when Frederick Buechner teaches us that vocation is where the heart's greatest gladness and the world's greatest needs meet. At that time, it felt unsafe for me to be in Baton Rouge. I could be, if I were out and openly gay, I could be fired on the spot. It was also a place that I didn't feel physically safe all the time.
Yeah.
And I also knew I wanted to gain more skills. I like to say I was, to your point, a little subversive. It was like, where do they teach the future politicians and business CEOs? I want to get those skills and bring it back here. And Stanford seemed like a great place to do that.
Well, when I think of identity, I think of a process of coming to know oneself in all of its beauty and creation. And of course, that's both sexual and how God is calling you to be in the world. You shared with me that being a gay man has been deeply enriching, even though it began in hard soil. Can you share with us how that has evolved for you?
Yeah. You know, I had not made the connection, Mimi, until you just asked that question there, that we all have our coming out stories. Right?
We do.
Because coming out means understanding who we are, accepting who we are, and moving out into community as our full selves. And so I really appreciate the framing of that. I was really scared for a long time. You know, I grew up in a very conservative, very loving home. I grew up very devoutly Catholic. And I was worried that this part of me could lead to rejection, a rift with God. And as a teenager, that's a really scary thing to hold. And so, you know, I was not one of those that kind of came out and said, oh, the day is great, the day that I came out. I came out because eventually I hit a point in my life that I was more afraid of who I would become in the shadows of the closet than who I could become stepping out into the world as myself.
Wow. Wise.
And I remember coming out to my father I was 24 years old. I was home for the summer between teaching and Stanford. I was on a ride to Home Depot, and I hated going to Home Depot. I used to call it the home despot, and my father was like, let's go. And I had, a couple days earlier, come out to my mom, and my mom said, are you going to tell your dad? And I was like, I don't know. And my dad said, Mom says you might have something to tell me. And I said, I do. I said, Dad, I'm gay. And he said, okay. He goes, I'm worried that you might be harmed, right? Because this was just a couple years after Matthew Shepard was killed.
Yeah.
I'm worried you might be alone, right? There was not civil unions, let alone marriage. And I'm worried your career might be hurt because in almost everywhere in the country you could be fired on the spot. And I said, Dad, I think I'm gonna be okay. And he said, okay. Your mom has a couple things we need to pick up, so let's go do that. And at no point, at any point after that, did he ever make me feel like his love was conditional or withdrawn. And what I learned in that moment, and I hope I live now as a community leader, but also as a parent, is, Mimi, there are times in our life when we are going to be given a split-second choice to choose between love or ideology. And my dad showed me, choose love every time. Because if you choose love, ideology can catch up. But if in that moment you choose beliefs, it's really hard for love to do the work of closing that gap. Not impossible, but hard.
Oh my gosh. Would that we could all learn that lesson.
Yeah.
Especially this morning.
Yeah.
I understand your dad is facing some challenges.
He is.
We will hold him in prayer.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry. I said I understood that his dad is facing some health challenges and that we will hold their family in prayer. So you mentioned your professional journey and how that has been impacted by your being gay. And perhaps it has shaped you in an identity within your character that you didn't even know, as you've suggested. You've been observed leading post-pandemic at the Princeton Club of Chicago, but that's applied across all of your endeavors of managing a variety of challenges, implementing processes, collaborating with communities, developing infrastructure, addressing big picture items. Can you tell us more about how these tools that you got at Stanford and Princeton helped you to make some surprising steps in your career development and possibly, thinking about how that self-awareness has kind of built into your long-term objectives.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll start by saying I have been so blessed by realizing that I can't control my path forward. I don't know if you remember The Price is Right, where they had the game Plinko, where you dropped a disc down and it bounced around. That's kind of how I feel my career has been. And sometimes I have to really lean into the trust and faith, but God has increasingly brought me to places that, as Buechner would say, was the right match for both what the world needed and what I loved to do. Mm-hmm. And I think, as a JD and MBA, as a first grade teacher, I ran public schools in Los Angeles. I've run community organizing teams in a dozen communities across the country, Native, Indian, and American reservations, cities, rural communities. And I think this quirky blend has given me just a unique set of insights. I think one is, it has made me a really strategic thinker because I pull from a wide set of data most people don't, right? I can pull from the research and the academic side and what the community leaders are saying, and I can pull from conversations that I have on the ground with people closest to the pain, right? I'm able to pull together really diverse teams. And I don't mean just diverse by identities, but diverse across professional experiences. If you look at the boards of directors that I've been able to assemble in the organizations I've run, I mean, we have, former senators and lieutenant governors and CEOs and former sex workers all on the same board, working together toward a common cause. Right? I've been able to tell stories that resonate with a broad base of people because I've had so many opportunities to interact with so many different types of people. Mm-hmm. And I think, if I only had had one set of experiences, the set that was the more traditional set, or the set that was the more grounded in community, I don't know if I would have been as impactful and able to hold communities through hard times as it would have been if I hadn't had these hybrid integrated experiences.
Mm-hmm. Well, many of our young people are facing that moment in their 20s of what do I do and how do I do it? How do I fit into that already large enterprise that is underway and find that wonderful blend between your passions and your skills and what moves you. You mentioned that one of the most important things was a priest who was a friend of yours in Santa Monica, who sort of helped you to think through some of that direction. Can you share with us more about that?
I think it was him, and I think it was just a number of various priests. I remember there was a Jesuit priest growing up that was really close to our family. When I was really struggling in Los Angeles with, can I be out and have a faith community? Monsignor Torgeson, who was the pastor at that time of St. Monica's, aptly named in Santa Monica, was hugely influential in that. And I think the source of it was just an analogous experience with what my dad showed me, is that a Christian community at its core is a home, and maybe even more at its core is a table, right? And in that table, I'm sure many of us have had this experience. When I am at the Thanksgiving table with my extended family, it is loud and cantankerous, and I can tell you we have not all voted for the same presidential candidate. But we hold that table. We hold that table because we have been through things together. We hold that table because we have contributed to it, because we are nourished by it, And we hold that table because we are stronger as a family and as a community when we can honor our differences, not ignore them, honor our differences, and then pass the potatoes.
And then pass the potatoes. I love that. I know that you didn't mention this, but when you were coming out of Stanford, you had the opportunity to go into consulting, to be one of the few that got a glorified position there. And you chose instead to go to Los Angeles and to take a Teach for America position, and from that to go to a classroom and sort of discover these places where that passion and your skills were meeting. But then you decided to go into politics.
I did.
Oh, tell us about that. And was your dad out there holding a placard for you?
He did. My parents did come out. I think I was the first and only Democrat they ever supported, so God bless them. But, you know, so you're right. I was very fortunate, graduating from Stanford, to be one of the few who had gotten a full-time job offer at McKinsey & Company. And I accepted it. And then Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, asked me if I would go run Teach for America in Los Angeles, which was the second biggest region at the time, and went down to LA and turned down my offer at McKinsey, which, as you know, is not frequently done. I loved my time kind of working across all, you know, dozens and dozens of schools in LA. And I, after a while, really missed, again, being proximate to the community. You know, I said after 4 years of the executive director at Teach for America Los Angeles, that I knew more about what the philanthropists and the donors and the superintendents cared than about families of teachers. So I took this opportunity to run a small charter school network in the heart of Hollywood, whose mission was racial and socioeconomic diversity. And in this community where, you know, we were working with the children of Oscar and Emmy nominees and network presidents and first-generation Americans whose parents didn't speak English. Similar to my time at Baton Rouge, I really fell in love with this community. And I was seeing, at that point, this was the Great Recession, how many decisions were being made about my kids and their lives by the powers that be in Sacramento. And our state rep at that time was termed out, and I said, I think it's time to run for office. And I did. It was an intense race. We had raised more than any other non-incumbent in the state except for one. We had gotten coverage in national media that we were called a fight for the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. And Mimi, I lost that election by 31 votes out of 42,000 cast. It took them a month to count the ballots. So if anybody says it doesn't matter if you vote, that's another gray hair that pops out of my head. But you know, that experience, as grueling as it was, really taught me about the importance of taking the leap, of doing the hard work and the risk, even if you can't see the future and guaranteed success. And also, maybe my hot take for the moment here is, you know, as much as we rightfully criticize elected officials and politicians, I also hold a softness and generosity in my heart, because it is deeply humbling to spend hours and hours every day knocking on doors and picking up the phone and saying, will you please honor me with your vote? So that was an important insight.
I think it is a very important insight as we go into the presidential election and as we all sort out where we can be most effective in our efforts. And I think that you spoke about the humbling experience of losing.
Yeah.
But you spoke about it so positively that I'd like you to share that feeling with our group.
I mean, I had had stumbles and, you know, setbacks before, but I think that big, massive failing, I mean, there is nothing like losing a campaign. That's like failing in public. And going into that, I was afraid of failure, right? I was afraid that People would look down on me. I was afraid that I would never be successful again. I was afraid that it meant that I wasn't legitimized in my work. And what shocked me was none of those things entered my heart when I lost. It was also a sign, like, don't hold anything back. I did not run a perfect campaign, but I ran the best campaign I knew how to do. I made the best decisions I knew how at the time that I made them with the information I had. And so I think the two things that came out of that surprised me. One that was a good thing was it didn't rock my sense of identity like I saw it rocked other people's identity. I knew I was going to be in the work. I knew I was always going to be in the work of making our country live up to the promises that she holds out. I just didn't know what that would be, and it wasn't going to be in this seat anymore, but I knew that. I think the part that was hard was on a campaign, you are telling a story every single day, a story to your voters, to your volunteers, to your donors, to yourself, about what your future is going to look like and how you're going to make a difference. And when you lose a campaign, that story gets ripped off in one fell swoop. And I felt in professional vertigo for years. Like, I knew I was grounded, but I felt like I was walking in a dark forest through the mist at night, and I didn't know what I was building toward. And I did great work during that time, and some of my closest friends and deepest lessons came in those following years, but it was hard to move through that period of uncertainty, feeling unmoored and not knowing where I was headed.
Wow. Well, in my school, you would get an A+.
Thank you.
But then you came to Chicago and you got married. I mean, what a great chapter was that?
I did. I'd love to tell this story if you don't mind, because
Please do.
I was running a national team of community organizers trying to get teachers who had worked in low-income communities more politically active. I had people in 24 communities across the country. And so I was flying to Baltimore from LA, and I had a layover in O'Hare. And it was in the summer, so the storms were rolling in, so I was at a bar, and I had my second martini. This is the blessing of martinis. I fired up my OkCupid dating app at that time and was swiping left and right, and I saw a very handsome man. I must have swiped right and got on the plane. 2 days later, we got matched on OkCupid. And I was like, how did this happen? And I was like, I was that second martini at Bubbles. And I looked at this profile, and here was a man who was active in his Christian church, close to his family, was a lawyer and cared a lot about his profession, loved country music. These were many things that I had that not a lot of other gay men in LA were expressing to me. So I emailed him on the app, and I said, and this is going to tell you a lot about how Toby and I approach things differently. So I said, hey, you seem great. Too bad we're in different cities, but I just wanted to say, best of luck dating out there. And he emails me and says, well, how do you plan to woo me from Los Angeles? And I said, I have no plans to woo you from Los Angeles, but best of luck out there. And then we just started communicating, and 6 weeks later I said, hey, I'm going to be in Detroit for work. I'd like to fly to Chicago, get a hotel room, see some friends. Can we have dinner on Friday night? And he said, sure. And fast forward, here we are. And I love that story because Toby was exactly who I prayed for and not at all who I had on my vision board. And just allowing God to direct us to the opportunities and the people that God knows we need to be with is an important humility.
Well, you have to share the story of the warming of the rings.
Oh, yes.
Yes, this is a great story.
It is. So when we got married, we, so as a queer couple, we have both the blessing and the curse of not always being able to rely on the defaults. And we had a great pastor. We got married at our church at the time, Lakeview Presbyterian. Pastor was Joy Douglas Strome. And so she asked us, how do you want your ceremony to be? And we'd come up with some ideas and some readings. And we wrote our own vows and did the traditional vows. And then she said, I'd like to suggest this one for you. And I said, okay, because we were really struggling with how could we honor the uniqueness of, and this was relatively new. This was 2016, a year after marriage equality was legal across the country. And she said, let's do a warming of the rings. And so after the ring bearers had come through, we began to make sure that as the wedding ceremony was going, the rings were passed throughout the church. And everybody in the church held the rings in their hands and said a prayer over them. So that by the time we were ready to exchange our vows and exchange rings, they had been held in warmth and had been prayed over by everybody in our community.
Oh, man, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Today, you have little Josephine.
We do.
But that hasn't always been such an easy thing.
No.
Why don't you share with us?
So we were very lucky to adopt Josephine, whom we call Joey, who's now going to be 6 years old. I told you, is very insistent that she is 5 3/4. So fractions is not a standard we have to worry about at kindergarten yet, so we're going with it. We had gotten approved. We did the adoption through the Cradle in Evanston, and we were on the list and approved. And we got an email on a Friday of June of 2018 that said, there's a birth mom who was already given birth. She didn't know she was pregnant when she went into labor. She has seen your book, and she would like to meet you. Are you okay with that? We said yes, and they said, look, we can't promise anything, but often with babies that are already born, if it goes quickly. So on a Friday, they said, can you meet on Tuesday? And we said yes, and we went on Tuesday afternoon. We had a wonderful meeting with Emmy, Joey's birth mom, who is still in our lives and an amazing, courageous woman. And at the end of that, she said, you are ready to be Joey's dads. Or do you want to do that? And we said yes. And so the next morning, Wednesday morning, Joey came into our lives. We call it our 5-day gestation period. We had nothing. I mean, literally, we went out and got, I'm not kidding, a pack and play, a car seat, and 6 white onesies, and that was it. We didn't even get diapers and formula. We're like, they'll give us that. And it just shows that, over time, you need a lot to raise a child. But really at its core, you just need love, faith, and 6 white onesies.
A lot of love.
Yes, yes.
And she's doing okay today.
She is. When she was almost 3, we received the diagnosis that she has cerebral palsy. Now, we knew something could be up. She did not sit up on her own until she was 13 months old, when a typically developing child will sit up at 6. She did not walk until 2 months after her 2nd birthday. Over a year after a typically developing child did. And we were in early intervention and seeing therapists and neurology. And for a while, they were like, let's just wait and see. And eventually, we decided we need to get an MRI. Cerebral palsy is brain damage that's received either in utero or at birth. So the only real way you can diagnose it is through a series of patterns of things and through an MRI. And when we got that diagnosis, it was a moment. It was a moment for us. But a week before, we sat down and said, okay, this might happen. How do we feel about it? And I went back. I had this literally moment of illumination, this absolute dispensal of grace to that conversation I had with my dad going to Home Depot.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, those 3 questions my dad asked were questions based in deficits and in fear. Because that's how dominant structures in society work. That if you do not belong to the dominant structure, that you will be lacking and missing and in deficit. And if you look back on my life, and certainly my husband Toby's life, so much of the richness of my life has come because of being gay. I am not happy and fulfilled and doing good professional work in spite of it, but because of it. And so I said to Toby, what if we just imagined all the goodness that could come from it? What if we refuse in this moment to accept a potential diagnosis as a reason to be sad and fearful? What if we made room for joy? And so we sat on that couch over bourbons. You're seeing a lot about how a cocktail works in our relationship. And we imagined, well, maybe she's going to meet the love of her life through some program of fellow people with CP. Maybe it is going to be through her struggles that she is going to be an artist or an author to give voice to this. Maybe it is under the care of therapists and physicians that she is going to be called to be a therapist or a physician. And it is not to Pollyanna-ish CP. It is not to gloss over the pain that will undoubtedly come from that diagnosis, like the pain that will come from many of us in many aspects of our life. But what we like to remind ourselves is the world does a good enough job of reminding us of the pain. The best thing we can do as parents is to hold space for joy. And that's what we've tried to do.
Amazing. I ask myself this question at times. Do I love sincerely and truly someone who thinks different from me? How does that really work? When you're not advocating for something, but you're understanding someone. And it seems to me that, gosh, through these past experiences, and particularly as a family now, you're growing into what it means to also raise that next generation. And I think about, how am I, at this age and stage of my life, also being raised into that next generation? And your current work for Equality Illinois is a way that you are doing that externally, outside of yourself, and your compassion and your understanding and your joy has really driven that. Share a little bit more about that.
Well, let me tell you a story about how I wasn't so good at that. When I was running the schools in Los Angeles, I had very early on in my tenure, the first couple weeks, had to decide whether or not to apply to the district to extend our charter to 8th grade. We could only go to 6th grade. And so probably 3 or 4 weeks in, I called the 6th grade families together. We sat in that way you only do in elementary schools, where you have people in middle age sitting in very small chairs. And, I laid out my vision. I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to apply for the charter. This is what the middle school is going to look like. And a mom raised her hand and said, who do you think you are? And I was like, tell me more. And it was like, you've come in here and unilaterally telling us what the future of this school is going to look like, and utterly changing our mission. And at that point, Mimi, I backpedaled and tried to save myself. But what I realized in that moment was I had been so focused on doing good to the community I was working with, not doing good with the community I was working with. I knew what our board and the principals thought was the right strategic decision, but I'd never asked parents what they wanted. So I went out and I met parents wherever I could. I didn't say just come back into the classrooms. I met parents in coffee shops and in their homes. And I said, tell me about, what do you want your school to feel like for a 7th and 8th grader? What are your hopes for your children? What are your fears for them? And what I learned was that it's not that the vision that I had and the strategic direction that I outlined was wrong. In fact, I think the questions of rightness or wrongness were not the most helpful one, is that it was incomplete. And I learned in that moment that what I think of as the twin talismans that should guide the work are curiosity and love. Curiosity is the intellectual wondering what part of the solution somebody else might have. And love is the belief that that person matters. And so fast forward when I started at Equality Illinois in 2016, when so many people thought the LGBTQ plus civil rights space was dead and dying because we had already won marriage, I went around the state and had 250 conversations with people in 90 days. And I didn't come with a PowerPoint. I didn't do what I did in that classroom where I was like, let me tell you my vision. I just asked the Ruby Sales question, where does it hurt? I asked people to say, tell me about a time that you have loved being a part of our community. Tell me about a time that you've been hurt. What are your hopes and fears? If you had a magic wand that can change the lives of queer people in a 5-mile radius from where we're sitting, what would that be? And I was in campsites and classrooms and coffee shops and church basements and people's homes. And after enough stories that people had gifted me that I could hold, I saw a vision forward for our work as a civil rights organization that was much more responsive to the breadth of our community and the depth of our community's pain that I would have if I just locked myself with my team in a conference room with research papers and a whiteboard.
God was really present in all that.
Totally.
Yeah. I have gotten a question here. So I didn't want you to think I was checking my email.
No.
But a comment and a question.
Great.
What a magnificent session, Brian. Thank you for your service, including specifically with TFA and the charter schools, and for sharing your journey. Interesting that you did your thesis on Gandhi, one of my heroes, who famously said, and I'm paraphrasing, I love this Jesus fellow. It is these Christians I'm not crazy about. My personal view is that this thinking is shared by many people, youth specifically included, and it is a significant reason for the decline in religion in the Western world. As such, it is a lose-lose outcome, arguably harming the most people who are not trying to get to know Jesus and have a personal relationship with him by simply judging others. Do you agree with this? And if yes, any suggestions? You maybe don't even have to answer this.
I love that.
We may be here another 20 minutes.
No, So I'm going to tell you a story that the scholar Kwame Anthony Appiah tells. He has an essay called Sidling Up to Difference, where the thesis of this essay is, we think or talk so much about the best way of going up against someone who disagrees with us is just to call it out, to hit it head on. And he makes a suggestion in cosmopolitan societies that maybe a more effective way, or maybe a differently effective way, is to sidle up to difference. And he tells the story from a British TV show called Skins, where a young man who's gay has his Pakistani Muslim best friend. And his Pakistani Muslim best friend invites him over to his house for his birthday. And he says, I'm not going to come until you tell your parents I'm gay. So the young gay man comes over, and his friend says, I didn't tell my parents. So the friend says, I'm not coming in. And after about 20 minutes, the father comes out, and he sits down, and he says to his son's best friend, I heard you're not coming in because you are gay, and my son didn't tell me. And the young man says, yes. And he says, I love my faith. And going to pray on Fridays is the highlight of my week. But you are my son's best friend, and he loves you, and I love you. Will you please come in? Oh. And what I love about that, and what Kwame Anthony Appiah teaches us, is he did not say, and my faith is wrong, and my religion is wrong when it comes to homosexuality. He just said, like my father, choosing between beliefs and love, he chose love. And I don't want to send the message, because it's not something that I believe, that to move in the world as a Christian, in a world full of people whose beliefs and actions differ from our beliefs and actions, that we have to ignore our beliefs or operate with a false humility that they're wrong. But I think those are less important to lead with than curiosity and love. And there is no better teacher in history to teach us how to move centering curiosity and love than Jesus.
Amen. I'm going to put in a plug for your book.
Yeah.
The Work is the Work. His most recent publication as of like
It's
2
actually
weeks ago.
May 7th is when it's coming out, so yes.
We may have to have a book group. In any case, I love, if there are any questions, anybody have some questions?
Thanks, Brian, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, your story, I guess I look back after you graduated from Princeton, and probably 95% of the people that graduate from Princeton go to high-powered consulting firms, law firms, and make a lot of money, and you went to be a school teacher.
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, that decision point must have been really hard. I mean, it seems like society is so based on monetary values, and live the great life. You got to make a lot of money, but you really pivoted there, and just just real interested in kind of that thought process.
Thank you for saying that. To be honest, it wasn't hard. And I think it wasn't hard for 3 reasons. So I do have a little bit of a former consultant in me. So for 3 reasons. One is I knew that service was the place of my deep gladness. That is not to say that that is everybody's place of deep gladness. And when I say service, I mean professional service. I hope everybody is called to service, but there are many ways and professions that people can. But it was just where I knew I meant to be, number 1. Number 2, I knew I had the unconditional love and support of my family. And that was incredibly important. And 3, I was blessed with this amazing education. It wasn't like it was this incredible safety net, the Princeton education, so that I didn't feel like if I went to go do this and it didn't work out, that I was eschewing all other options. And I think that was really helpful. So, yeah.
Thank you. I actually am sad to say that we're coming up on our time limitation. Brian, we could go on. I have so many other questions I could ask you, but I just want to thank you that you can leave us with this sense of joy, humility, and most of all, love.
Yes.
And that is the kind of love that maybe an agape kind of love. And so I'm going to ask Luke to close us in prayer.
This is a prayer that came from a teacher, and when his disciples said, "Teach us how to pray," this is what he said. Let's say it together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being
Thank
here.
you.
That was really wonderful. Really wonderful.